going to provide some tips for preparing for the CFA exam. Now, before I start, let me give you a little background. I started the CFA program in 1996, and I completed the Level 3 exam in 1999. In addition, I've reviewed some of the readings that you will see in the candidate reading book, and I also, a number of years ago, went down to Charlottesville to the CFA Institute to take a course on how to write end-of-chapter problems. Okay, so I have some understanding of how they prepare the exam. I have my own experience from taking the exam, but I also have some idea as to what they are looking for. Okay, so as we know, the CFA program consists of readings that cover a broad range of topics, okay, that the CFA Institute believes that a practicing financial analyst should be familiar with. So how do they decide what topics to cover? Well, the CFA Institute brings together experts in the field of finance from academia and industry who decide what should be included in the curriculum. These professionals then produce learning outcomes or learning outcome statements that provide guidance on what candidates should know. So in the early years when I took it and before, these learning outcome statements help them to determine which articles or chapters or parts of chapters should be covered in the program. And it was a little bit of a mess because there was this hodgepodge of textbooks, chapters, and outside readings. Now, they would sell you textbooks at a pretty significant discount, but you had to scrounge around for all these articles to read. There were some that they might send you, but you might read, a few chapters in one textbook or parts of chapters in one textbook and then parts of chapters in another textbooks. So sometime after I completed the program, maybe 2005, 2008, something like that, the Institute decided that they would like to provide candidates with more specific directed readings. Okay, they wanted to own their own readings. To do this, they commissioned experts to write chapters on specific topics, and the chapters were oftentimes written jointly by a practitioner and an academic. Today, candidates get several volumes of readings when they register for each level of the exam, okay, which makes it much nicer. It's quite daunting when you see how much there is to read, but it's much easier than having to scrounge around for different chapters in textbooks. So the authors were guided by the learning outcome statements that the Institute meticulously prepared. The learning outcome statements provide guidance to the candidate on the depth and breadth of knowledge that they believe a practicing financial analyst should know. Each level of the exam covers a large number of topics, and candidates can't be expected to know each one in the kind of depth that might be required in a course. Okay? When your professor spends several classes on a single topic, he or she can go into great depth, asking you to solve a complicated problem, maybe derive a formula, but they're not going to ask you to do that here. Remember, they don't know what field of finance you're going to be in as a financial analyst. You might be a bond analyst, you might do international, emerging markets, you might do equities, and a lot of different areas for financial analysts. And they want you to cover a little bit of everything. So this is where the learning outcome statements are so critical to preparing for the exam. Okay? These are not afterthoughts. Learning outcome statements are not afterthoughts that are tacked on to the beginning of the chapter, but guide what was written in the chapter and how questions are prepared for the exam. Okay, as a college professor, oftentimes we have learning outcome statements for each chapter of a textbook. But I have a feeling that many of these professors simply just slap them on at the beginning, of the chapter because their editor told them to do so. They didn't think about, this is what I want covered. I mean, they know what they think a student should cover in a chapter, but they don't think of it that way. you want to keep in mind that the wording in the learning outcome statements is critical to determining what's expected of a candidate. Okay, so each of these learning outcome statements begins with essentially the level of depth that is required for the topic. Calculate, describe and interpret, explain, define. So when I was taking this course on preparing these end of chapter problems, they told us to look at those things and to be true to them. And I'm sure that this is also true of the actual exam. If it says explain, then you don't have to be able to calculate. If it says describe and interpret, that's what you need to do. Remember, some topics are fairly complicated. Say the Black-Scholes option pricing model. That's not something that is easily done, in one of these exams where you're covering a lot of topics. You should know what it is. You should understand essentially how it works. But, they may not ask you to do a calculation for it. So that's the one thing to keep in mind, okay? That the exam writers don't just make up questions they deem to be interesting. Okay, we college professors sometimes do that. Sometimes I didn't tell them to cover this topic or to be able to solve this, but I'm going to throw it on the exam anyhow, just to see who learned a little bit more, who's my real superstar student. That's not what the CFA Institute does. Okay, so if they don't tell you to calculate, you don't need to be able to calculate. Okay, a couple other tips on question types. Okay, we're all familiar with the term multiple choice. Now, multiple choice are standalone questions with a bunch of choices, right? A, B, C, D, etc. But the key point is they are standalone questions. You can solve them by simply reading that question. For example, a question like, what's the future value of $100 invested today in 5 years at an interest rate of 10%, right? You don't need any other information to solve that. Then there's something they refer to as item sets, okay? They would like students to go into, or candidates to go into a little more depth than just simply multiple choice questions, but there's so many people taking the exam that having lots of problems to solve is just impossible. Okay, in the early years, there were not as many people taking the exam. When I took it, level 3, I'm pretty sure, was all problems. So they've gone to something referred to as item set. Now, these look like multiple choice questions with, an A, B, C, D, etc. But they require you to read some short passage in order to be able to answer the question. So they're not standalone questions. So it's important that you read the passage instead of just trying to answer the question. It may turn out, that what seems like the right answer is wrong because the person who was the CFA or, the investment professional actually said something wrong to the client. Okay? Oftentimes it's put together as a dialogue between an investment professional and a client. So you have to make sure that you do those readings before you try and answer the question. All right, a couple other little tips for the exam. Learn to use a financial calculator. Okay, there are a number of calculators from TI and HP that are approved for the exam, and it's much faster to solve the problems using a financial calculator than it is a formula. Okay, even if you remember what the formula is. Now, I know people who think, the financial calculator is not of great value, all right, that it's better to use a spreadsheet to solve the problems or perhaps to do them by hand using formulas, and there's value in those. But you're trying to pass the exam, all right? You don't need to know the meaning of present value. You need to solve the present value problem, and you'll do it faster with a financial calculator, likely with less errors. Another thing that I would tell you to do is work on your intuition. Okay, as somebody who's been a college professor for a long time, it's amazing to me how many times I get answers that just don't make any sense from calculations. Okay, so for example, a variance of 0 only occurs if all the values are the same. But you can get a 0 variance if you forget to square the deviations from the mean. Okay, so that's a possible mistake. Now, it may be obvious to you now, but when you're taking an exam, you're under pressure, sometimes this stuff happens. So you got to sort of stop yourself and say, does this answer make any sense? And if it doesn't, go back and check your answer. In fact, I'm pretty sure I was taking the CFP exam about a decade later from the CFA exam, and I'm pretty sure that I did a calculation like that where I got the variance of 0. And, you know, it wasn't one of the choices, but also my intuition said, oh, wait a minute, this is a stupid answer. So I went back and you know, recalculated and realized what I had done. Okay, you want to know the difference, for example, between variance and standard deviation, because as multiple choice answers, they're likely to give both as possible answers. Okay, the wrong answers are what they refer to as distractors. They're supposed to distract you from the right answer. And, you know, unlike perhaps the multiple choice questions you might get in a textbook, you know, or from a test bank in a course you're taking, where one of the answers is just really stupid, they generally try and make those distractors something that would be a common mistake. So they asked you for standard deviation, but the variance is one of the choices. So you have to know the difference, and you have to make sure that you get the right answer. All right, they're going to give you these common mistakes: multiplying instead of adding, okay, or adding instead of multiplying, or multiplying instead of dividing. So those are always going to be possibilities, but if you use your intuition, you may be able to figure out, oh, wait a minute, I was calculating present value and I got a number that was bigger than the number I had. It should be smaller. So those kinds of things will help you a lot. You'd be amazed at how often students don't do that. They don't ask themselves, does this answer make sense? Okay, so those are a few thoughts I have on the exam. These will help you. Again, be true to those learning outcome statements. They really consider them important at the CFA Institute. And good luck taking the exam.